So, hello everyone, and welcome along to a rather special edition of Susty Talk, ED's ongoing series of video interviews put together to keep our audience of sustainability and energy professionals talking, feeling optimistic, and also connected during what is now the start of the second lockdown period here in the UK and beyond. I'm ED's content editor, Matt Mace, and as mentioned, this is a slightly different approach to our usual Susty Talk series. We're 1 week into our Net Zero November, which, for those a bit out of the loop, is through dedicated virtual events, online articles, business guides, podcasts, and masterclasses and videos like you're watching now. Net Zero November is essentially a month of content that will help sustainability and energy professionals on their net zero journey, whether that's agreeing on and setting targets through to scaling up on-site solutions and empowering other areas of their organisation to embrace the need for climate action and to act on that as well. So to mark week 1 of Net Zero November, we're extending our Susty Talk video format into a virtual discussion with 2 people to discuss the net zero energy transition. As you can see, I've already been joined by my 2 guests for this panel. So today we have Tom Hayes, Councillor and Cabinet Member for Zero Carbon Oxford, and Baumerte, the Sustainability Manager and Community Energy Contact at Northern Powergrid. So thank you both so much for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Good. And so we're going to be discussing net zero through the lens of the energy transition, what's required both from the kind of infrastructure aspect, what needs to change, but also from the organisations and the cities that are going to kind of be the key to that transition, what needs to change internally in terms of ways of working to ensure that we deliver a zero carbon energy mix by 2050. We'll get into the intricacies of that shortly. To start with, I'd just like to invite both of our panelists to introduce themselves and a bit more about their role and their organisation has to play. So first up, Tom Hayes.
Brilliant, thanks Matt. I'm Tom Hayes, I'm a councillor in Oxford. I'm serving on Oxford City Council where I'm the Deputy Leader and the Zero Carbon Oxford Cabinet Member. We deliberately framed the title of the role as Cabinet Member for Zero Carbon Oxford because we wanted to come up with a solution, not the problem. So we didn't think it was appropriate to call me the Cabinet Member for Climate Emergency, for instance. And that's a really deliberate decision because we want to frame all of our responses around the solutions we need to bring into being and work with our citizens and businesses to bring that about. As an elected figure in a democratic body, I have a job to reflect and represent the views of my city and my councillors in my council, but also to play a role as a leader to try and inspire and encourage and educate people to take part in this journey to zero carbon. And that's particularly important when it comes to energy. If we look at the country, energy is for most part the problem when it comes to our carbon emissions. If we can fix the energy problem, then we can really get quite far down the road to building a zero carbon Britain within the time frame set by the government. 84% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions come down to energy, and it comes down to the 3 fossil fuels, particularly coal, particularly oil and gas. We've done a tremendous job as a country in recent years of stripping back our coal use. And in Oxford, energy is a really big part of our emissions problem too. So energy really is in everything that we do in all parts of who we are. It's particularly the case when it comes to transportation emissions and housing and building emissions in Oxford. 81% of Oxford's carbon footprint is caused by our buildings. If we don't fix our buildings, we aren't going to fix our carbon footprint problem. And 16% of our transportation emissions, 60% of our emissions come from transportation. So it's really important that we accelerate as much as possible our effort to address our energy use in those particular areas. And we held a Citizens' Assembly on climate change last year to look at 5 particular themes, one of which was energy, and one of which was buildings, and another was transportation, and to get insights from the public represented in that room, a representation of viewpoints and backgrounds about how the council can play a role in decarbonising our energy, transport and buildings, but also how the whole city can play its part. So really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks for that, Tom. And yeah, we'll definitely be touching on that kind of engagement aspect and how you kind of energized that debate, I'm sure. So also we have Anda as well.
Hi, thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is Anne Baumet. I work as a sustainability manager for Northern Powergrid in the policy team. Northern Powergrid is the electricity distribution network operator in the Northeast, Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire. So we own and operate the electrical infrastructure to deliver energy and keep the lights on in our area. And as such, we are a key enabler for meeting the net zero targets in our region. So my role is predominantly externally focused. I work with our local stakeholders on discussing how we can make net zero future a reality in our region when it comes to decarbonisation of transport, decarbonisation of heating, and other topics where many of our local stakeholders and local authorities have set much more ambitious targets for meeting the net zero objective locally.
Great. So it sounds like we've got quite a lot that we can discuss around that external engagement, which I think our kind of key audience at ED is probably something that that's a key challenge for them. A lot of them, not all of them, are probably in organisations where energy or sustainability is a bit siloed. So to be able to hear from two organisations that are really focusing on engaging different parts, whether that's a whole city or whole regions in that case, there's going to be some valuable advice through this conversation, no doubt. So yeah, as mentioned, net zero by 2050, it's going to require a massive overhaul to the UK's energy system, up to a 4-fold increase in low carbon sources, according to some reports. And that's all well and good, but actually I want to start on the fact that we are entering into a second lockdown into the UK, which came into force earlier this week, and I imagine it's causing a few, I don't say teething issues because it's a second lockdown, and from what I've spoken to, a lot of organisations have adapted very well to the first lockdown and how they were operating and going to, but essentially we're looking at a scenario where emissions from the global energy sector is going to be about 7 to 8% lower in 2020 than 2019 because of lockdown and the fact that it essentially paused a lot of key productions and parts of the economy. That's of course going to probably rebound next year as and when the economy kind of and social interactions kind of build up to I suppose normal levels. And it's quite clear that what happens now in this period of lockdown, and as businesses and organisations perhaps pivot with some massive financial or health concerns alongside it, that how energy use and sustainability is placed into the hearts of companies will shape what happens first. But a good place to start would be how both of your organisations actually coped with lockdown and the pandemic and affected your organisation's ability to work on the net zero transition, whether that slowed as the result or whether it actually gave your organisation a chance to have more virtual conversations about it. And if I go to you first, how was Northern Powergrid impacted by the lockdown, and how was that? Did it change anything around your focus on zero carbon energy? Or
thank you. I think the lockdown and the unfolding pandemic has really highlighted our role within the communities that we serve. So as I mentioned earlier, we serve about 8 million customers across the region, and of course, I think a lot of them have changed as a result in their daily practices. I think one aspect that we've seen is the number of our colleagues being recognised as key workers, and we've been working hard to improve our practices and processes to make sure that there is a reliable electricity connection for all of our customers, but also working with the NHS to connect the new Nightingale hospitals within our region, and of course through supporting our communities through various other channels and initiatives as well.
Great, and I suppose internally between you and the rest of your team, or perhaps other areas of Northern Powergrid, did the company adapt pretty seamlessly to virtual meetings rather than face to face? Have you found any benefits of this way of working?
I think it's a good question, and of course it has been a progress, and it still is a work in progress, and I imagine it's similar in other companies as well. And I think we've managed to successfully move a lot of things we do online. It's quite interesting in this year in particular because it comes as we're in the middle of this very extensive stakeholder consultation. As a regulated business, we are preparing in advance and planning in advance for our next price control period, which runs from 2023 to 2028. So we're in the middle of consulting our stakeholders of what they want us to do in these 5 years. And where we had planned a range of face-to-face events, we have actually had to switch to online events and online platforms. And I think it has been very different, but in some cases it has actually allowed greater participation, both from our colleagues and also our stakeholders, because for many it has been more efficient. And then of course there are challenges where online events don't quite deliver the same engagement that in-person events do, but we try to adapt as best as we can.
Yeah, we at edie feel that those teething pains of that transition as well, having to put Net Zero Live, which we're running next week, onto a virtual platform has been eye-opening, but I think it's the direction of travel, so it's got to be done. Tom, same question to you then. I mean, having spoken to you previously around Oxford's zero carbon mission and how much kind of outreach you were doing with obviously citizens, but also businesses in the city as well. How I imagine the pandemic's caused a few challenges for your overall ambition.
It has. It really has. It's primarily happening in two ways. So the first is that as a local authority, we've had to respond to the crisis on a day-to-day basis, which means massive redeployment of our staff into what we created, which were locality hubs. So community-based hubs, which could then collect and distribute people's prescriptions. Same with food parcels, emergency food parcels, to ensure that lonely people or people who are isolated or with mental health concerns were able to access support. And so it's been a real refocusing of the effort of the council onto that emergency need. Then secondly, it's also been around the fact that we as a council have been underfunded for a decade by central government, and we were asked to do all that was needed in order to meet the pandemic, but the money hasn't come through. And so we're in a situation heading into our next budget where we need to find several £1 million worth of savings, which for Oxford is quite unique because year after year we've been able to balance our budget despite the underfunding. For the first year now, we're facing the prospect of potentially having to make service reductions. So that's a very unique place for the council to be in, particularly in terms of local government. But, you know, I always like to think of what are the positives, what are the rare upsides that you can extract from this absolute horror show. And some of those are that while we can't be together face to face to have exactly as just said, the more impactful, meaningful engagement and conversation, there is now the possibility for having more virtual conversations. And I don't think anybody wants to be strapped to a screen for 8 hours a day. Certainly this many months in, we've got a lot of learning to build on, but we are really clear now about how we can use virtual to do the engagement that we need. So to give an example, we were committed this year to holding a zero carbon summit, which brought together all the partners and stakeholders and large emitters in the city. And we're all guns blazing trying to organise that, probably at lower cost because we don't need to have a face-to-face meeting, and people's diaries become a little bit more flexible to enable that to happen sooner. Similarly, we're going to be hosting a youth climate summit, and uniquely, because Oxford is a very outward-looking and international city, we have now been able to connect through Oxfam, the aid charity based in Oxford itself, Oxford being its home. We've been able to connect to poorer, disenfranchised people living in the global south who are right now affected by climate breakdown, so that young people in Oxford can hear directly from people around the world who are experiencing climate breakdown now, and hopefully feel inspired and educated about the need to go even further. And in terms of looking at our emissions, it's going to be a really interesting picture. So we've obviously seen far less travel on our roads during the first lockdown. That will disproportionately be coming from fossil fuel vehicles, so we expect emissions to drop from transportation. We saw a 59% improvement in air quality in the first few months of lockdown in Oxford City alone because of that drop in transportation. But we're likely also to be seeing increases in emissions from buildings, because as more people are working at home, which may not be so energy efficient, we're probably going to be seeing greater leakiness as we head into the winter months, leading to an increase in our emissions from buildings. And I guess the very final thing I'd say is that we obviously, as a council, have been redeployed to addressing the emergency, but some work just doesn't stop. So Oxford is home to Project Energy Superhub Oxford, a really exciting £40 million partnership between the City Council and Pivot Power. And we've got contractual obligations and timetables to keep to. And so we've been doing that. And Energy Superhub will be going on track to be the world's first project, which is pioneering an integrated approach to decarbonising power, transportation and heat. And all of that, by sticking to the schedule it's on, will help Oxford to accelerate its journey to zero carbon.
Great stuff. So good to hear a lot of optimism from both of you. I suppose the short-term transition to this way of working and how that hasn't derailed your ambitions for zero carbon, at least in the short term, which is great. Obviously, zero carbon transformation is a long-term goal, and there's a lot of hurdles to overcome, a lot of barriers to get through. But as Tom rightly pointed out, there are reasons to be optimistic, and I think I'd rather focus on them for a bit, and perhaps we'll come back to the which I'm guessing going to be policy barriers or technology barriers to finish off. I suppose a silver lining, for a lack of a better term, from this pandemic, if there is such thing as a silver lining during a pandemic, is the fact that this green recovery narrative has emerged, and it seems that a lot more people have got a renewed focus on how climate action, climate mitigation, and low carbon infrastructure and green jobs can actually help build back better. Is essentially the narrative that's being spoken about. We've seen glimpses of it from the government so far. The summer economic update was more of a jobs recovery than a green recovery, but a lot, multi-million pound investments into key green parts of the economy was welcome, and the latest offshore wind commitments from Boris Johnson, and with more to follow as well. It sounds like we're heading in the right direction, even if it's not fully joined up. The UK is clearly embracing the green recovery in some way to help its own net zero target. My question is how are your organisations approaching the green recovery? How are you creating optimism about this transition in what is quite a disruptive and pretty glum and time? So Andrew, if I come to you on that one.
Thanks. Yeah, so we recognise where we are in terms of being a company that is quite large and has that regional presence and regional reach. And we think that we have a key role in facilitating the green recovery. And it might be for things like green skills or green jobs in the next few years. But it's also about that economic stimulus and investment locally. So we invest about £1 million in our network every day to maintain it. When we look at this investment strategically, kind of in the months and years going forward, where we focus it in terms of time and location would probably go some way in facilitating a recovery that is green and hopefully a recovery that is fair to everyone.
Great. And the same question there to Tom.
Well, exactly as you say, there's a crisis happening right now, and we can dwell on the negatives, of which there are many, and people are really struggling and having the hardest times they'll ever know. We can also try to do that alongside looking at the possible ways that we can create a better Britain. And I think that's especially where I'd like to focus my energies as a councillor. I think we can talk about climate breakdown, and we have been for a number of years nationally. But there's still, to my mind, a sense that it's not quite cutting through. So while awareness is rising, while people are better educated, the salience of the issue has not increased to the extent that we need it to. And I thought there was a really interesting set of polling by Britain Thinks, the consultancy, which talked about people's priorities. And while I would have expected climate to rise up people's priorities in recent months, in fact, it's staying still, if not falling. Understandably, public health and the economy are now foremost in people's minds. But then there are other aspects of people's lives which kind of crowd out the climate breakdown that we face. And I think that presents a real challenge for us, because frankly, people have gone through a lot over the last 10 years. They have seen a reduction in spending to public services. They have seen the economy having to bounce back from the crash in 2008-9, which took a long while to recover. And we've obviously seen, a rise in populism and increasing instability around the world, which is also happened here in the UK. It's been a tough decade. And then when you put the pandemic on top of that, people who have already given so much and sacrificed so much are now having to do even more just to meet the needs of the pandemic. How do you in that time ask them to further the green recovery? Especially when so many people think of climate breakdown as something which is scary, global, powerless for them to control. But also, for a lot of people, will make them think that trade-offs and sacrifices are needed. And I think this is why the power of a narrative and vision is even more important. I think we need to talk about how throughout all of our economy, we have a chance to build back better and build a better Britain, to be independent, to be as self-sufficient as we need to be modelling the industries and economy of the future. And we need to be seriously putting the investment, private and state, into achieving that. And I think energy is a place where it can absolutely happen. I think that not just in terms of energy supply, but also energy generation.
That's a great point. It's actually one of the questions I wanted to come on, which is the role of the energy manager, the sustainability manager. Oh, sorry, and it sounds like I've seen the raise hand function, so thank you for using that. It makes my job moderating this much easier. So do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just, if I may add to that, please. Decarbonisation is one of the key drivers, if not the key driver, in the energy sector, which we're part of. You know, during this year and before, and probably going further, we are always having conversations with other energy sector or energy industry players, as well as local stakeholders and local governments about their net zero ambitions and their plans for meeting that, because infrastructure is a key part of it, making that happen, isn't it? And what we've seen during our consultation on our business plan and the conversations we've had within this year, that ambition has not changed. If anything, it might have increased. We've seen a lot of community groups being energized by the net zero target announcement, and in the kind of pandemic, we've seen more communities coming together and being united by this collective vision or action. And at the same time, the local authorities, and more than a half in our region, are planning to meet the net zero target between 2030 and 2040s, which is hugely ambitious. And they're not easing off. They still have this target, and they're working really hard to get there. And we're here to support them in that process. So the point I want to make is that ambition is very real. People still want to make a change, and we haven't seen a change in that attitude to decarbonisation locally.
No, great.
I think that's a really interesting point. So the government setting the 2050 law into place, and local councils declaring climate emergencies up and down the country, if not around the world, setting science-led targets and deadlines for achieving a zero carbon council or a zero carbon country, a city or community. I think all of that is fantastic. It's setting out your stall, it's motivating your public, but also internally your organisations to drive towards that goal. And I think that's been especially useful where in Oxford we've got a sustainability team that has for many years delivered really exciting trials and technologies, and sometimes world's first. But within the council, it's been a siloed part of the organisation. It's had to work with planning, it's had to work with housing, it's had to work with transport, but not in any sustained and joined up way. By having these declarations, you actually really mobilise that internal governance and cultural change. And I think exactly as you're saying there, you're starting to see the outcomes of that. That year or two of cultural change, starting to see that really bubbling up. And I think now is a quite right moment to, if there is funding coming downstream, either from government or the private sector for infrastructure enhancements or investments, you've got now an internal governance structure in the actors who could really leap on that and make it happen. No,
that's a really good point. I mean, I referenced it at the start, but research suggests that net zero in the UK will require a fourfold increase in low carbon energy. That's including expanding offshore wind capacity by up to 75 gigawatts. And I think it's Atkins Global's net zero report actually kind of highlights that there are still capacity and policy barriers that the UK needs to overcome. Severe capacity gap in carbon capture and storage, nuclear, wind and hydrogen energy generation as well, technologies that have all been outlined as essential by the Committee on Climate Change when they provided their advice to the government last year. So while it's great that it seems regions up and down the UK and businesses and councils are all aligned to this, what's your role in ensuring that policy is put in place and that the direction of markets move towards overcoming these, I suppose, infrastructure and capacity barriers. Tom, if I start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think councils have got a really critical role to play because we're at the intersection of our communities and also investors in our city. And so our communities are having their salience of climate breakdown increasing, but not at the rate that needs to happen. But we've obviously got investors coming into the area motivated by the council's climate emergency declaration, by the fact that Oxford is a knowledge-rich city with a history of significant engineering and car making, and the world-class universities we have here. And it's about trying to bring that together and to do it in a way which is truly democratic and collaborative. Because while we've got, for instance, Project Energy Superhub Oxford, which will lead to such things as, you know, the largest EV charging hub in the UK, we need to make sure that the public know that that's happening and they feel confident about upgrading their fossil fuel vehicles to an electric vehicle. And it's about finding out from them what are the barriers which will lead to that increased uptake. How on earth do we try and meet them locally? But more often than not, how do we try and encourage the government or the other enablers of that action to recognise the need for action and accelerate it, and just really try to unlock the potential of this overall decarbonisation agenda? And then the example I would give is around the sale of new electric vehicles and the deadline for that. So the government had originally set the deadline that by 2040 there would be only electric vehicles sold. There wouldn't be any new sales of fossil fuel vehicles. They brought that forward, obviously. At the Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change, we asked the public in that room a series of policy questions, one of which was, do you think that the ban on polluting vehicle sales ought to be brought forward? And overwhelmingly, people said yes. They felt it was a signature on a page decision. It made so much common sense that you should just crack on and do it. And we've been able to use that to lobby government in order that they do actually accelerate their electrification of transportation. And our job really is to lobby and to campaign and to reflect the insights from the public, but also investors to make that happen.
No, great stuff. Yeah, and it looks like that lobbying is paying off. It's one of the many things that's essentially the murmurs around Whitehall is that it's coming. It's just a case of getting that sign off. So great to see. And Northern Powergrid, obviously, they are essentially put the infrastructure that will help the transition. They oversee it all. So what's your organisation and your role in kind of spurring that demand for new technology or existing technology, but just at a bigger scale?
Yeah, and I think Tom has used a very good example of the electric vehicle policy and targets, stimulating quite a lot of work and effort across the industry and locally and from the society. So when we look at what the future might bring to get to grips with that uncertainty, we model some pathways that it could take in terms of low carbon technology uptake, increase in electricity demand, and a range of different factors. We've published these as well, and we're looking at a range of different scenarios, and I think each of them will hold a mix of solutions, but electricity use and demand will increase either way. But which one of these pathways actually becomes true and materializes is really so very dependent on the policy. And I think here the EVs are kind of the take-up of EVs is the perfect example. The Climate Change Committee have evidenced and analysed the existing gap that we have between our aspiration and the legally binding net zero target and the current policies in place, as well as the market mechanisms. So in a way, at present, we have the target, but we don't have the means to deliver that. And looking locally at those more ambitious net zero targets that have been announced here, and many of them aiming for 2030, which is just a decade away, a lot of their plans and initiatives hinge on the policy decisions being made centrally. So I think that will be a key influence for everything that happens and what we do and how we respond to that. And even if you look at the previous few years, the policy signals have been a key factor that has influenced different low carbon technology uptake. Heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar panels have so very heavily dependent on the policy signals. But then I suppose in our role in that is why we're having this holistic engagement program with our stakeholders, and why we're talking with them today is because at the end of the day we deliver public service, we deliver service for them. So knowing what their aspirations are allows us to prepare and deliver infrastructure that's ready for them. So that is kind of an evidence base that we're building and we're taking to our regulator to also facilitate what those local plans and aspirations are. But I don't want to downplay the importance of different policy decisions that are made nationally that will have a key influence on anything in the future.
And just on that, so in Oxford, we're going to be hopefully still the world's first zero emission zone, delayed slightly by the pandemic. It feels like every time you want to have a government lockdown come in, you just start the next round of consultation on the zero emission zone. But that's going to be only allowing zero emissions vehicles into a geography of Oxford. We've also got some really exciting trials and technology. So we've got the world's first pop-up electric vehicle charging points. We've got some really exciting electric vehicle charging points for the use of hackney cabs, which we're requiring to get to zero emissions as a fleet by 2025. We've got really exciting cable gullies and lamppost chargers, and we'll have Oxford producing the UK's largest EV charging hub, thanks to Project Energy Super Hub Oxford. But we're grappling with this. We're basically realising that in order to decarbonise transport, we need more electric vehicles. But we also don't necessarily have the full data set that we need to make these sorts of decisions. And this is something that government could really help with. So government could really help with EV migration by resourcefulness studies which are needed for each local authority or each local area to truly understand what EV infrastructure is needed to meet its own policies. And that's not just alongside the 2040 Road to Zero strategy, but also the government's own 2050 zero carbon deadline. And if they did that and they supported local authorities to do that, then they could actually really focus their financial resources and their overall resources on the local authority areas where the largest downside gains could be made in facilitating EV uptake. And that could really have a massive dent on the carbon footprint produced by transport in the country.
Yeah, I absolutely agree to that. And I think there is also a key role for data and collaborative working. And I think we're realizing even more that this is an emergency. We need to collaborate. We need to work together, everyone. Otherwise, we're not going to meet our legally binding target. Otherwise, we're not going to deliver positive, sustainable outcomes for the society we live in. And the pathways that I've mentioned previously, we've taken it a step further and we've shared it all as open data to help and facilitate some of those decisions and some of that transparency, because having a set of data that we share or that we improve on allows some of that to happen.
No, that's a very, very good point. And I was going to touch on policy wishes, but you kind of both covered it off. But obviously, I mean, 2020 for us, as bad as it's been, 2021 hopefully offers some big opportunities. COP26, of course, which was meant to be taking place now, next year. The UK government said it will publish a net zero strategy, so that should outline these pathways that we're desperate for. So it's a big year for organisations like both of yours to actually really make sure that those, you know, the things that businesses and organisations and councils and cities all want to drive this transition is very much in place. I'm worried that we're almost out of time, so I do want to touch on one final question. It's been great to speak to two organisations that are really driving this net zero carbon agenda. My question to you both is, for anyone who's watching that doesn't have a net zero target in place, or is wanting to, they perhaps don't have the capacity to do so yet, or they're just a bit unsure about it. Why do you think the organisation should focus on net zero and science-based strategies as a response to the pandemic? What benefit do you think that will bring? Andrew, if we start with you on that.
Thank you. I don't think there are many positives to the pandemic that is still unfolding. But I think if we look at the lessons and we learn from them, it has delivered a tremendous amount of change that we didn't think was possible. It has delivered an unplanned intervention. And it comes at a time when we're looking at net zero targets and decarbonisation. So we can see another unplanned or catastrophic event coming in the near future. So I think if anything, change is possible, and we've seen that, but also we need to be prepared for the unexpected, as evidenced by the current pandemic, and as we're very aware of the climate change that and the effect it would have on us as a global society and as a local society. And I think a very important thing to not forget is that it's not only an environmental and technical challenge, it's also a social challenge. And if we're talking about building back better, we need to build back better in a way that we also deliver a fair, just system. And I think the pandemic has really showcased the interconnectivity of all our systems and our lives with the environment, with the economic system, with the social systems.
No, that just aspect is incredibly important. I think, yeah, as you mentioned, the pandemic has proved that even though anyone can suffer from it, the society is kind of disproportionately impacted by it based on how well off you are to begin with as well. Tom, final words from you then.
I mean, people may fall down on either side of this question, but do people remember going to the cinema to watch Forrest Gump just 26 years ago? Do they remember watching the TV show Friends when it debuted? If those things don't feel that long ago, because it was 26 years ago, then does it scare you to know that we've put more emissions into the environment, into the atmosphere in the last 26 years than we have in all the centuries before? I mean, if that is something which is scary, and I don't ever want to cause people to feel alarm in order to change their behaviour, if they do feel scared by that, then that's the reason why we need to be motoring, if you'll pardon the pun, towards a zero carbon Britain, and using our position as a leading nation to encourage other emitters in the world to also do their duty. And COP26 is a phenomenal opportunity for us. Oxford actually was very cheeky and asked the government if we could host it. And we didn't get an answer, but Glasgow will be a fantastic host. And they've got a great strapline, which is People Make Glasgow. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to COP. I think people will make the COP. We need to be very clear about the communities that want to take action, those that may not know how to, but could be motivated to, and bring them all together so that we've got the best possible push for decarbonisation at that COP meeting. And I guess the other thing that I would just say is that although it is scary that if we don't take the appropriate action, we will have unhelpful things unfolding in our societies, it's also worth saying that what is a very big issue, what is a very global issue, and what can make people feel overwhelmed is so easily broken down. And that's what science and evidence can help with. It can map out a pathway. It can help people to feel reassured that we've got this, but we've not got many more years to get this. And so hopefully we'll look at the science, we'll look at the evidence, and we'll not just decarbonise the economy and the society we live in, but we'll also, exactly as you was just saying, try to do that in a way which builds a fairer, kinder, more inclusive and compassionate society to live in, and raise our children and grandchildren in.
Yeah, no, the people aspect of this conversation has really stood out, which is really refreshing to see. And I think it chimes in a lot of discussions I've had with energy and sustainability professionals about, action, whether it, don't, I always get this saying wrong as well, but it's don't let perfection be the enemy of progress or be the enemy of good. But essentially any steps, and Tom, you mentioned it with the trials that you're doing, any steps that you can take now will provide key learnings as well. But thank you both so much for this discussion. I feel like we could have kept on going for another half an hour, but it is an extremely busy time for you both, and myself included. So I will stop it there. But yeah, thank you again, Andrew and Tom, for your time today. So this Susty Talk, as mentioned, is part of a month-long programme of content brought to you in association with EDI's headline partner, EDF Energy, and that includes the virtual Net Zero Live, EDI's flagship event, which has been turned virtual this year, which is all about accelerating climate action. That's taking place next week, and there will be a link in the article and the video that you're watching now if you want to find out more about that, and also Net Zero November and access all our content, which includes features. If you're watching this, the US election, for example, may still be undecided. There's a great feature on what the results of that could mean for COP26 and the net zero transition. So if that's your interest, do check out that content as well, and if you'd like any more information. But in the meantime, do stay safe, stay positive, and keep up the Susty Talk.